Hello everyone, this is Julie. So welcome to lecture 2 this week. We are going to be covering Chapter 14, which is teaching every student. So as I mentioned in the prior video, there's a lot of overlapping material between the two chapters, so it shouldn't be too hard for you to get through both. So let's go ahead and look at the objectives for this chapter, which are to identify the characteristics of effective teachers and effective classroom climates, to develop learning objectives using Bloom's taxonomy, to know the meaning of universal design for learning, to define differentiated instruction and adaptive teaching or adaptive instruction, and explain the effects of teacher expectations. So, jumping right in, the characteristics of effective teachers. So there are 3 characteristics that effective teachers appear to share. They are clarity and organization, warmth and enthusiasm, and knowledge. Clarity and organization. So when things are cloudy, it is hard to see what is important. And if you don't provide a roadmap, how can I get there? So all I'm saying here is that for students to understand what they need to know, you need to be clear. And you need to provide some kind of organization so they can see where you want them to go. In terms of warmth and enthusiasm, consider this. Does liking the teacher lead to liking the subject? Possibly. Certainly we can think of teachers that maybe we didn't find to be particularly warm and enthusiastic, but maybe we got a lot out of the course. Those tend to be the exception rather than the rule. We do know that positive emotional climate does lead to student engagement. So students do tend to react positively to those they like, just as we all do as human beings. And this last part, knowledge. Expert teachers draw on their mastery of both teaching as a skill and pedagogical content knowledge. So content knowledge is knowledge of the subject. So if you're a math teacher, knowing math. If you're a science teacher, knowing science. So pedagogical content knowledge is knowledge of how to teach your subject matter. So you need to know what you're doing and how to guide your students there. And sometimes, in fact, almost always, this requires flexibility. So as instructors, we need to have flexibility in order to teach and reach the students that we have in front of us, in whatever capacity we have them in front of us. So you may not be directly in front of me, but I certainly consider you to be my students, and I certainly consider that I need to have some flexibility in how I approach you as a learner. Instructors need to be concerned about the classroom or the learning environment. So the reason for this is simple. It is an instructor's job to facilitate learning. To do this, we need to be sure that we are providing the kind of scaffolding and support that promotes all efforts to learn. And there are 3 areas or domains that we should be addressing, and those are the affective, the cognitive, and the behavioral. And this organizational chart provides a detailed description of these areas as well as some examples. So the affective domain, just as it sounds, affective has to do with emotional support. So we want to provide a positive climate where there is warmth, mutual respect, positive emotional connections between teachers and students so that students feel safe, they feel secure, and they feel like they can be themselves. If we create a negative climate where we have disrespect, anger, and hostility, it's not going to be a benefit to us, and it's certainly not going to be a benefit to the student. Other areas are related to the affective domain are teacher sensitivity. So this is consistency and effectiveness in responding to students' academic and emotional needs. So we don't want to have a student come up to us, for example, and say, oh, my dad died last night, and then act like we don't care. So we need to be sensitive to our students. And certainly the example that I gave wasn't an extreme, but you will have times when students will come up to you and voicing needs or concerns whether it be my boyfriend's pressuring me to have sex or my dad beat me up, and you're going to feel like, I don't know if I want to deal with this, and you're going to have to be ready to be a vessel for their concerns, right? So someplace that they can put them. Lastly, in the affective domain is regard for students' perspective. So creating activities that encourage student autonomy and emphasize students' interests, motivations, and points of view. So allowing them, again, to be who they are as people. And this becomes particularly important if you're dealing with students in adolescence. So as we looked at with Erickson, you can certainly see where you want to help contribute to a student's developing not role confusion, right? We want to help them to develop identity. So second domain is cognitive, and this is providing instructional support. So cognition has to do with thought. So some of the areas here are concept development. These are activities and discussions that promote higher order thinking skills and cognition. So forcing students maybe to be reflective, to do activities that really make them think. And it's weird because you might have the misconception, or you might even feel like you don't want to have to think, but students actually enjoy it. We like to be challenged. We like to have something that makes us use our brains. Maybe not every day and maybe not every minute, but certainly when looking back on the projects that I most enjoyed, even in high school, those were things that really pushed me. Second area in the cognitive domain is the quality of feedback. So this involves consistency in providing specific process-oriented feedback. So not just saying great job, but this was done really well. You developed this sentence, you developed this concept. This, on the other hand, was not so good. Here's where you're lacking. So it really becomes a push for instructors to do this when you have 45 students or you have 60 students. It's hard to say, oh, here's the feedback, but it is your job to do this. If we're not providing specific feedback, students aren't getting from us what they need to develop as learners. So we really want to be thinking about feedback as being a scaffold to get them to that next level. And on that point, back and forth exchanges to extend students' learning. So allowing students so you provide the feedback and then allowing them to question you about it and going further with it. Again, it's, I said scaffolding before, but we can also think about this as being the zone of proximal development. So always, how can I get this learner a little bit farther in their development? In the behavioral domain, we have classroom organization. One of the aspects there is behavior management. This is teachers' effectiveness in monitoring, preventing, and redirecting misbehavior. We can look at productivity, how consistently learning is maximized with clear activities and routine, teacher preparation, efficient transition, and minimal disruptions. All of these areas we will look at later in this course. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about them. And then lastly, instructional learning formats, how well materials, modalities, and activities are used to engage students in learning. So the next thing that we want to think about today is what's the roadmap? So creating objectives. Creating meaningful objectives for students helps them understand what they need to know, and it helps us guide them there. Instructional objectives are what we expect students to be able to do by the end of the lesson, unit, etc. So as you may have noted, I do instructional objectives in every single one of my lectures. In addition, quite often you'll find objectives at the beginning of chapters. So Woolfolk does an excellent job of providing those for you. So it's important as a student, which is where you're at now, for you to identify those, but also later on when you develop your career as an instructor, you want to be providing these for students as well. So all of this does is it provides transparency And while that might not seem important, it truly is. It really boils down to how can we expect them to get to the destination if we don't tell them where they're going. And that being said, objectives can be broken into two broad camps. One is behavioral, so there are things such as being able to list, define, add, or calculate, and then cognitive, being able to understand, recognize, create, or apply. For those of you who are planning on a career in K through 12, you will be expected to build your objectives from the Common Core standards. For those of you that may not be aware, the Common Core standards, or Common Core, as it's often referred to, are national standards established for each grade. These are what the government expects students to be able to do/learn in each grade. In essence, the Common Core is a set of expectations, and they are important because government funding is tied to students meeting them. So whether we like them or not, they are things that we would be dealing with in K through 12. In order to get students where they need to be learning, in terms of learning, we need to understand some of the underlying structures of knowledge acquisition. And we'll begin by looking at Bloom's taxonomy. In 1956, Benjamin Bloom and his fellow researchers published a taxonomy of educational objectives. This taxonomy has been influential in the research and practice of education ever since. As you may already know, taxonomy is concerned with classification. So what Benjamin Bloom and his fellow researchers did was create a way to classify educational objectives as things we want students to be able to do. Bloom and his colleagues categorized objectives from simple to complex, i.e. from factual to conceptual. These key elements are referred to as Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom and his colleagues actually developed two separate domains or areas. Those are cognitive and affective. And these are the types of knowledge, or these two domains are areas where knowledge could be broken into or placed into. A third, the psychomotor, was added by later researchers. Simpson actually did this in 1972. So if we look from left to right at the pyramid hierarchies presented in this slide, there are 6 levels. We can start by examining the cognitive domain. So there are 6 levels in the cognitive domain: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. In the affective domain, there are 5 levels: receiving, or being aware, or attending to something in the environment; responding, showing some new behavior as a result of experience; valuing, showing some definite involvement or commitment; organization, integrating a new value into your general set of values; giving it some ranking among your general priorities; and then characterization by value, acting consistently within the new value. And then lastly, the psychomotor domain consists of 6 levels, with the entire psychomotor domain being characterized by the amount of coordination that is developed. In essence, this is very much a model similar to Piaget's stages. All 3 domains are created as hierarchical models, with the most complex skills being at the top rung of the pyramid. While each domain and type of knowledge is important, most educators, as you can imagine, are concerned primarily with the cognitive domain. Therefore, I'm going to spend a few minutes going through each of the types within the cognitive domain so we have a really good understanding of those. Okay, starting with knowledge, which is the lowest rung of the ladder. Students at this level, a student recalls or recognizes information, ideas, and principles in the approximate form in which they were learned. So you can think of this is what we tend to think about when we think of a multiple choice question. Verbs used at this level would be write, list, label, name, state, or define. So again, frequently you'll see knowledge objectives on multiple choice quizzes or exams, measuring whether students can recognize or recall the information. For example, which of the following definitions best explains the process of osmosis? At the second level, we have comprehension, which is translating, interpreting, or extrapolating information. Comprehension is showing that you have an understanding of the information as well as the ability to use it. The student translates, comprehends, or interprets information based on prior learning. Verbs used with this type of assessment include explain, summarize, paraphrase, describe, and illustrate. Frequently, you'll use this type of objective measured through the use of short answer questions. For example, explain and illustrate the water cycle. On the third rung, we have application, which is using principles or abstractions to solve novel or real-life problems. Application objectives require students to use or apply knowledge or principles to solve practical problems. Students select, transfers, and uses data and principles to complete a problem or task with minimum direction. Verbs used with this type of assessment include use, compute, solve, demonstrate, apply, construct. Frequently, you'll see this type of objective measured by use of a project or problem. For example, construct a plan for building a miniature bridge. The fourth rung is analysis, or breaking down complex information or ideas into simpler parts to understand how the parts relate or are organized. The student distinguishes, classifies, and relates the assumptions, hypotheses, evidence, or structure of a statement or question. Verbs used with this type of assessment include analyze, categorize, compare, contrast, separate. Frequently, you'll see this type of objective measured by use of an essay question. For example, compare the news report on Obama's trip to Cuba received from daily newspapers to that available from internet sources such as Facebook, Twitter, and blogs. On the next rung, we have synthesis, or the creation of something that did not exist before. Synthesis objectives include using skills to create completely new products. This is the creation of new idea or higher learning. Student originates, integrates, and combines ideas into a product, plan, or proposal that is new to him or her. Verbs used with this type of assessment include create, design, hypothesize, invent, develop. Frequently, you'll see this type of objective measured by the creation of a project or object. For example, design a lesson plan that defines the multiple intelligences. The top rung, we have evaluation, or judging something against a given standard. Determining pros and cons about a particular subject, student appraises, assesses, or critiques on a basis of specific standards and criteria. Verbs used with this type of assessment include judge, recommend, critique, and justify. Frequently, you'll see this type of objective measured through a writing assignment. For example, compare the strengths and weaknesses of two home computers in terms of flexibility, power, and available software, and provide a recommendation for which is the better choice. So I should note, or I need to note, that in the 1990s, Lauren Anderson, a former student of Bloom, revised the taxonomy. As a result, a number of changes were made. The names of 6 major categories were changed from noun to verb forms. This truly makes sense as the taxonomy reflects different forms of thinking, and thinking is an active process. In addition, the knowledge category was renamed. Knowledge is an outcome or product of thinking, not a form of thinking per se. Consequently, the word knowledge was inappropriate to describe a category of thinking and was replaced with the word remembering instead. Comprehension and synthesis were retitled to understanding and creating, respectively. This is in order to better reflect the nature of thinking defined in each category. And then lastly, creating was moved to the top rung. Even with the retooling of Bloom's, it is most often taught as a progression our succession of achievement. However, as the examples earlier hinted at, some levels align themselves with specific domains and question types. In fact, what we need to be thinking, as the pinwheel at the bottom of the slide suggests, is that we can think of Bloom's as providing a means for us to gain an assessment of where each student is in their learning. In the lecture on Chapter 4, I briefly mentioned universal design for learning as a strategy for addressing the needs of different learners. In this lecture, I will spend a little more time talking about UDL, its conception and application. Again, UDL is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people. It is based on scientific insights into how humans learn. We can consider it a blueprint for creating instructional goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone. Not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but flexible approaches that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. It is important to note that UDL is based on neuroscience and the idea that there are 3 primary brain networks that work together to create knowledge acquisition or learning. These are, if we look at the diagram on the right, the recognition network, the strategic network, and the affective network. The recognition network allows us to identify and interpret patterns of sound, light, taste, smell, and touch. This enables us to recognize voices, faces, letters, and words, as well as some more complex patterns such as an author's style and nuance and abstract concepts like justice. The strategic network allows us to plan, execute, and monitor mental and motor patterns, including such diverse actions and skills as sweeping the floor, deciding a chess move, or choosing a college. Lastly, the affective network evaluates patterns and assigns them emotional significance, enabling us to engage with tasks and learning and with the world around us. UDL seeks to engage all learners by providing multiple means to activate these networks, and this is done through multiple means of representation, that is presenting information in different ways, multiple means of expression, allowing learners to express learning in different ways, and multiple means of engagement, using different ways to engage learners. Woolfolk describes 2 different means of addressing the needs of every student: differentiated instruction and adaptive teaching. Differentiated instruction addresses learner differences by grouping students. In the past, grouping students by ability was fairly frequent, where students were grouped by ability. For example, students might be grouped into high achieving, middle achieving, and low achieving reading groups. These groups are fixed and do not adequately account for variances of students as they encounter new materials or lessons. Flexible grouping, on the other hand, allows groups to be changed based on the needs of individual students as they come up. Groups, and we can put that in quotes, may also be pairs, small groups, the whole class, or even disbanded completely as needs arise. Adaptive teaching, on the other hand, is allocation of resources, especially technology, to assist individual needs of learners. In fact, typically adaptive instruction is limited to technology devices that are used to assist learners. Woolfolk, however, takes a broader view. In order to keep things simple within this course, we will limit adaptive instruction to instruction aided by such devices. That being said, let's take a look at some of the examples of each type. As I read through these, think about the similarities between them as well as the differences. Why would it be important to consider the use of both in a modern classroom? What are some problems for teachers in using these methods? What are some problems for students? Do the benefits outweigh the problems, and why or why not? So my differentiated examples would be varying sets of reading comprehension questions for students reading different books, either chosen by the student or the teacher. providing personalized course packets with individualized remediation or enrichment materials, assigning an adaptive assessment that gets easier or harder depending upon how a student is performing, coaching a student one-on-one to address his or her specific challenges, grouping students into small groups, which are designed around their strengths and weaknesses so that they can tutor each other. My adaptive examples: a student using a physics program answers quiz questions about angular momentum incorrectly, so the program offers supplemental materials and more practice problems on that topic. Second example, a history student answers questions about the War of the Roses correctly the first time, so the program waits an interval of time and then re-quizzes the student to make sure that he or she is able to remember the information. A math student makes a mistake with the specific step of factoring polynomials while attempting to solve a polynomial equation. So the program provides the student with extra hints and supplemental practice problems on that step. And then lastly, an ESL writing student provides incorrect subject-verb agreement in several places within his or her essay. So the program provides a lesson on that topic and asks the student to find and correct her mistakes, his or her mistakes rather. My last thought for this unit is on teacher expectations and the consideration that teachers' beliefs and expectations can, as the quote says here, bolster or undermine student success. In order to ensure that our expectations don't have a negative influence, we should consider how we use information. We should employ flexible groups, provide challenges and support for everyone, even our most successful. We should think about how our responses and nonverbal communication will be interpreted by the student. We should reference different ethnic groups so students don't feel like outsiders, and generally just eliminate all bias to the best of our ability to be fair. To communicate a belief in learning, and most importantly, to seek to involve all students in the process of learning. And that concludes what I wanted to share with you on teaching every student. Have a great morning, day, or evening, and I will see you on the discussion boards.